hours talking about good clinical practice, practical application and implementation. So this is not a GCP course in the respect that we're going to talk through the basics of GCP. We're going to talk about good clinical practice, some of the changes and updates, and the expectations for how we use good clinical practice, how we think beyond just those regulations, and be mindful of other entities and other laws and other items we need to be aware of when we are thinking about engaging in human subject research. So we always look to see the regulations and guidelines that govern the conduct and oversight of this type of research, keeping in mind that really our product in good clinical practice in clinical research is getting credible data from protected subjects. So we're going to describe the elements of a functional quality system at the site level, and that's where everybody comes together at that site level. When we go out and audit a site, for example, we are looking at the sponsor, the monitor, the IRB, the investigator, the institution, all ancillary staff, to understand how they are working together to meet the requirements of the protocol. We'll look at some recent trends in noncompliance, look at the role of SOPs in good clinical practice, talk about the differences between legal and procedural elements of GCP. So there are a lot of things that we do in clinical research that we do because we've always done them that way. But we are trying to adapt ourselves and our processes to what we believe the FDA is looking for. And we'll also talk about some key differences in pharmaceutical device and biologics good clinical practice in terms of the regulations and some of the other governing documents. Okay, so we need to be mindful of what the expectations are for good clinical practice, those common elements of GCP that most of us know. 21 CFR Part 11. So this is electronic records and electronic signatures, and I put that in parentheses because a lot of folks still don't think of it in terms of being a regulatory requirement, but of course the Federal Register does. And the FDA has told us we are not going to cite you necessarily to these regulations, but we will cite you for failure to maintain adequate and accurate records. So if they are, whether they're paper or electronic. So we've seen warning letters go out to investigators and others for not having systems that are appropriately backed up or for sharing usernames and passwords, those sort of things. 21 CFR Part 50. This is human subject protection through the document and process of obtaining informed consent and assent. 21 CFR 54, financial disclosure. So this is how we gather potential information or information for potential conflict of interest or bias. It's one quantifiable way to assess that potential for conflict of interest. Keep in mind that it's certainly not the only thing that we need to be aware of. We've done actually a pretty good job of controlling the money in clinical research, but there are other areas where we could introduce that potential for bias. But we're looking at this in terms of money, stock, equity, interest, those sort of things that have been provided to investigators and sub-investigators. 21 CFR 56, how our IRBs are structured and how they function. So we know that under 21 CFR 312 and 812, we're required to work with an IRB that is compliant with 21 CFR 56. Sponsors and investigators on the Form FDA 1571 and 1572 respectively are required to work with IRBs that are compliant with 21 CFR 56 for initial and continuing review. But we have to make sure we are actually assessing those IRBs. So unfortunately, very few of us, or quite a few of us, are failing to perform vendor audits of our IRBs, including looking at our local IRBs. So we have to think about that IRB. Is it registered as required under 21 CFR 56.106? What type of registration? So there are two types of IRB registration. There's OHRP type only, meaning that that IRB will use 45 CFR 46 or the common rule for assessing those studies. And there's 21 CFR 56. So OHRP type only registration looks at that common rule for federally funded research. And OHRP FDA type also includes review as appropriate for studies using 21 CFR 56. So it's important that we understand the type of IRB that we are working with because the regulatory authorities will be looking for this as well. We need to think about the documentation we gather to support their compliance with 56.107. So oftentimes we'll get a federal-wide assurance number or an FWA number from these IRBs, but be mindful that that is really meaningless to us in industry-sponsored research. That's just the IRB telling OHRP that they will be compliant with 45 CFR 46 and not 21 CFR 56. So these are some of the things that we need to be mindful of. So even though we might know these regulations and be able to rattle them off, what do they really mean? How do we use them? And we are aware that there are changes, maybe not as fast as we'd like, but there are changes to the regulations. We've seen changes to 50, we've seen changes to 56 over the last few years. 21 CFR 312 and 314 for our drugs and biologics. This is our IND and NDA. 812 and 814 for our IDA, PMA. So we're looking at this information, right? Sponsor responsibilities, investigator responsibilities, and it's why it's so important that IRBs are appropriately using the regulations to assess the risk for these studies, because 45 CFR 46 doesn't talk about sponsor responsibilities, for example, because the government is the sponsor in those studies. So we have 45 CFR 160, 162, 164 for HIPAA and high-tech that we need to be mindful of here in the States, certainly working outside the U.S. We would also take into consideration any other local privacy laws.